MS Ramaiah University of Applied Sciences.
Good morning, students. Let us discuss about the measurement of bore diameter of a specimen using bore gauge. This experiment aims at measuring of bore diameter of a given specimen using bore gauge. The bore gauge setup consists of bore gauge, dial gauge, bore gauge pin, micrometer holder, micrometer, standard specimen and 18 to 34 mm bore gauge pin set. A dial bore gauge is a special tool calibrated to measure the accuracy of up to 1 microns and which is used to accurately measure the bore diameter of a cylinder or pipe. In combination with a micrometer, a bore gauge will read the diameter of the bore. A typical bore gauge comprises of a shaft with a dial indicator at the top and a measuring slet at the base. The measuring slet consists of 3 guides and an actuating plunger dial bore gauge provide quick and accurate readings on the size less than perfect roundness or wear. The apparatus required to conduct the load cell experiment are bore gauge pin set, micrometer, vernier caliper, magnetic stand, dial gauge. The procedure for carrying out this experiment as follows. Note down the specimen diameter which is to be measured by using vernier caliper. Select the specimen diameter bore gauge pin from bore gauge pin set. Attach bore pin, plunger probe with reference extension and unwheel onto a holder with a dial micron indicator by applying minute pressure. Calibrate the assembled bore gauge set using a micrometer. Insert calibrated bore gauge instrument inside the bore of the specimen such that the pin tip and the spring are in contact with the opposite surfaces of the bore. During inspection, the spring-loaded centering bridge centers the gauge in the bore. The bore diameter is determined by a movement of the dial indicator on the dial gauge. The reversal point of the measured value display states the deviation from the setting master. The readings obtained from the experiment must be tabulated in the format of a tabular column. Carry out the calculation using the standard formula and note down the reading of the bore diameter. Benefits of the experiment. Very good linear accuracy will be obtained. Performance analysis of R&R will be measured. Limitations of the experiment. Accuracy is dependent on user handling.
Hi students, name of the experiment is calibration of bore gauge. Aim of the experiment is you are going to measure the internal diameter of any cylindrical surfaces. Operators required for conducting the bore gauge experiments are vernier caliper. Vernier caliper is required for measuring the internal diameter of the diameter initially. Bore gauge. This is the bore gauge. You can measure a range from 18 to 35 mm of a diameter. Dial gauge. 1 micron dial gauge required for measuring the tolerances of the diameter. Bore gauge pins. These are bore gauge pin in the range of 18 to 34 mm diameter. Micrometer with magnetic stand. This is a micrometer with a stand. So we are going to calibrate the bore gauge diameter with the micrometer and specimen required for measuring the diameter. This is a bore gauge specimen. So we need to measure the diameter of this specimen with a tolerance. Now let us start the bore gauge experiment. So first step of the bore gauge experiment is we have to measure the internal diameter of the given specimen by using vernier caliper. Now by using vernier caliper, I am going to measure the internal diameter of the given specimen. I can see, you can observe from the vernier caliper, the diameter of the specimen is 30 mm. From the previous step, we measure the diameter of the given specimen. So diameter is 30 mm. So I need to take the 30 mm diameter bore gauge pin from the whatever range it is available. Now I will pick up I will pick the 30 mm diameter bore gauge pin for inserting in the bore gauge. Now I am going to insert the 30 mm diameter bore gauge pin in the bore gauge. Just take this. Now after inserting the bore gauge in the bore gauge pin in the bore gauge, now I am going to insert the dial gauge in the bore gauge. So you have to hold the bore gauge like this by inserting the pressure gauge. So by applying small pressure in the bore gauge, you have to ensure that smaller needle should align with the zero value. Once you fix the dial gauge and it's set 0 in the dial gauge by applying the pressure, now we can move on to the micrometer with stand. In the micrometer also you have to set the same 30 mm diameter standard. Then lock it. First you have to set 0 in the smaller dial gauge. So now we set the 0 just applying the small pressure. So we align with the 0. So for a bigger needle you have to calibrate with the micrometer. So by trial and error method, so I am going to insert this bore gauge should align with the 0 value in the bigger needle, bigger dial. Okay, once you set 0 in the bigger dial, so after calibration of bore gauge with the micrometer, I am going to insert the bore gauge in the specimen to measure the internal diameter of the diameter. Now you can observe the bigger needle as well as the smaller needle and you can see the value. So and the bigger needle is moving in clockwise direction and you can observe the value in smaller dial. It's approximately approximately 0.615 mm. So the diameter of the diameter of the specimen will be 30 minus 0.615. So that will give the internal diameter of the given specimen. So it concludes the bore gauge experiment.
At MSR UAS, we spark your imagination unlike any other.